A big thank you to Hasselblad for sponsoring this video.
I'm always super paranoid about being out with an unreleased camera. I always think I'm going to bump into a camera enthusiast and they're going to say, "Ooh, what's that?" And then they'll take a photo of me, and then 24 hours later that photo will be all over Twitter, or X now, or Threads, or wherever. And then my NDA will be in tatters and I'll spend the rest of the year in court. It's where my mind goes quite quickly. Kind of catastrophic thinking. And the thing is, they're more likely to do that with this camera than basically any other, because it looks very different to most cameras. So this is the Hasselblad 907X CFV 100C. It's a medium format, 100 megapixel camera, and well, look at it, it's absolutely tiny. Now, a bit of context, just over a year ago, I think it was, somebody at Hasselblad reached out to me and asked if I wanted to try what was their new camera at the time, the X2D. And after a bit of back and forth, I said no, ultimately, because I was featuring lots and lots of gear on my channel at the time, and I didn't want my channel to become a gear channel. And that's still very much the case. But now, the gear that I use day to day is much more settled, and I've featured an awful lot less gear recently than I had back then. So when Hasselblad reached out a couple of months ago to ask if I fancy trying this, well, I was much more interested. Partly because I've been featuring less gear, but also because this is so different. And if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll know that I have a soft spot for cameras that are a bit different. Because as much as I love cameras like the one I'm filming on now, this is the Sony a7 IV, technically brilliant, has never put a foot wrong. I reckon if you stood, I don't know what, 10 feet away from it and put one of half a dozen brand names above the mount, I don't think it would look out of place. You can't really tell whether it's a Nikon, a Canon, a Sony, a Fuji. It's just a black camera box. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I like cameras that are a bit different. And this is very different. So yeah, like I said, medium format, 100 megapixels, but to be honest, I think that's the least interesting thing about this setup. And what I'm most interested to try is what it's like to shoot with, given that ergonomically, it's entirely different from anything I have ever used. So yes, here we are in Bethgelert, very sleepy village. I've come here because I think I'd be very unlucky to find a camera enthusiast who had interest in this. But I guess time will tell. Fingers crossed we don't. It's definitely a novel shooting experience. I feel like I'm using one of the old 500 series film cameras from Hasselblad. And I mean, you could use this digital back with one of those to get 100 megapixel digital files using your old film cameras. I don't have one of those, so I can't, but I imagine it would be a good bit of fun. Also, it probably won't shock you to hear that I'm using the XCD 55mm lens to test this camera. In full frame field of view terms, that translates to about 43mm, my kind of lens. And aside from the field of view, my favourite thing about this lens so far is the configurability of the aperture ring. So this aperture ring doesn't have hard stops on either end of the aperture, which might not be to the taste of some people, but the advantage of it is that you can configure it. So at the moment, I've got it set to change exposure, and this little dial here, this is changing the aperture, which is very different to what I'm used to, but I'm quite enjoying it because of that. Probably got enough shots of this church now. I kind of like the way that mountain frames these buildings in basically exactly the same tones. That kind of looks quite nice. I'll tell you one thing I'm taking from shooting like this, i.e. looking down at the camera, is that regardless of the camera I'm using in future, I am going to try and do it an awful lot more if I'm using a tilting screen, because it's such a simpler way to shoot. Normally, if I'm looking through a viewfinder with a camera like this, then regardless of whether I'm looking through the camera or with my eyes, I'm looking at the scene. I think sometimes that gets a little bit confusing. Whereas when I'm shooting like this, I'm only looking at the scene through the eyes of the camera, which means I'm not getting confused about what the camera is seeing versus what I'm seeing, and I don't know if I'm making much sense, but basically, I'm starting to think that this is actually quite a good way to shoot, regardless of the camera that you're using. I don't know about on brighter days. If there's no cloud and the sun's shining brightly, maybe I'd think differently, but days like this, I think it works quite well. Ooh, I've got some bird flight in that one. It's nice. So yeah, the modularity of this camera is really quite interesting to me. I mean, the camera itself is this tiny little slither here that says 907X, and then everything behind it is the digital back, which can be taken off and put onto the older film cameras. Very, very interesting idea, and this is just the latest iteration of this idea, but it's really my introduction to it because I've not used any of the other previous models. Now the modularity also stretches to this grip here, and when you use the grip, it feels much more like a conventional camera, for better or worse. And I say conventional camera, I mean conventional by modern standards. But it has the added advantage of, for whatever reason, making me feel like a fighter pilot. I don't know if it's because it feels more like a joystick than a camera grip. And there actually is a joystick on the back of it for focusing, which works very well with the Face Detect autofocus. And there's a shutter button and a couple of dials and 4 buttons. That said, I'd probably shoot mostly without the grip, because I think the charm of this camera is that it's very different. So good to have though, I guess, if you want this camera mostly for its novelty, but there are times where you want it to be a bit more practical. Perhaps this will come in handy. Some other bits and pieces to say about the camera. There's a USB-C port hidden here, which is good for charging and also data transfer. And on data, actually, there's 1 terabyte of internal storage in here. And I'm a big fan of internal storage. My Leica M11 that I had last year had something like 64 gigabytes, which was a touch light for a camera that shot 60 megapixel files. Now, obviously, this shoots 100, but it's good to see a decent amount of storage accompany that. In, as I say, a terabyte. What else? Oh yes, lens compatibility. Obviously you can use these XCD lenses, which are fantastic in my testing, but also you can use V lenses with an adapter, H lenses with an adapter, and X-pan lenses, again, with an adapter. Or of course you don't need an adapter for your V lenses if you put the V lens on your film camera and then just put this digital back on. So, lots of options. Now with the files, I've never shot with a Hasselblad before, I've never shot with a medium format camera before, and I've certainly never shot with 100 megapixels before, and I didn't actually expect that much of a step up between 60 megapixels and 100 megapixels, but the detail is frankly hilarious. And whether or not I need this detail, I mean I don't need 60 megapixels, but it's quite nice to zoom in and have a look at it. I mean, it is hilarious. Look at those leaves. Now, Hasselblad talks about their natural colour solution, which, to tell you the truth, I thought sounded like a bit of a gimmick when I first heard about it. But basically, as far as I can tell, it's a pledge from the company to aim for natural, lifelike colours. And it's helped with cameras like this, I guess, because they can collect 16-bit files, which essentially means you've got hundreds of trillions of colours at your disposal. And even just looking at these files in Lightroom, they do look fantastic. And I guess for someone like me, I mean, I'm not massively concerned with accurate colours, to be honest. I'm not a portrait photographer looking for perfect skin tones. I'm not a documentary photographer. Basically, I'm just not the sort of photographer who's all that bothered about whether the reds or the blues or whatever are entirely accurate, because I'm going to edit the images anyway. But it's nice to start editing your photos from such an accurate benchmark, I guess. And in the little messing around that I've done so far, the files are a joy to work with. And yeah, I'm far from the authority on medium format image quality. This is the first and only medium format camera I've ever used. But there seems to be a lot of talk on the forums that I've been reading about different cameras from different brands sharing sensors. But that doesn't necessarily equate to the same image quality, obviously, because different brands will treat their colour science differently. They'll take the data from the sensor and do different things with it. And Hasselblad has got a very good reputation in that regard. And I can see why in the files. 100 megapixels though. Madness. Anyway, that's some initial thoughts on this camera. I will be using it a few more times in future videos, I'm sure. And as I said at the top, this video is sponsored by Hasselblad, but they've not forced me to say anything particular. I wouldn't have agreed to the video if they had. And overall, I really like the camera. I am intrigued to see how it performs in very harsh daylight when you're shooting, looking down at the camera and the sun is also beating down on the screen. That will be interesting. But for the minute, I really like this camera and I'm intrigued to use it a few more times, so that'll be coming up on the channel soon. But yeah, overall, my biggest takeaway from my day shooting the camera was relief that nobody else saw me do it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I am going to pretend to be a fighter pilot a bit more. Probably stop doing that. Very valuable camera.